Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we have some grave encounters for you indeed. We're going to be heading to the cemetery/graveyard for some truly terrifying experiences. So I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. We have lived in this house for almost 8 years now, and there are lots of things to share. Our neighborhood sits on the original town cemetery from the 1800s. In the 70s, when they built the neighborhood, they only removed the graves they needed to put in the foundation and the sewage system. We didn't know this until we had been living here for 3 to 4 years. But when we found out, it certainly explained a lot. While we were still in the process of moving in and hadn't even spent the first night in the house, I heard 2 little kids talking. I heard it clear as day. A girl probably of around 10 or 12 and a little boy who sounded no older than 5. I only have 2 brothers, both younger than me but still older than either of those kids. It sounded like any younger siblings playing, and because it sounded so normal, I can't remember exactly what was said. Obviously, the first thing I did was call out to them, and then the playing stopped. I never heard them leave. I searched the house and no one was inside. Everyone was in the backyard putting together our swing set. I told my mum what I heard, and she of course didn't believe me. I dropped it and we moved on. Months later in my room, I'm trying to sleep, when I roll over and see the reflection of a girl in my TV screen. I realized I was seeing her back, long curly blonde hair, and a blue dress that appeared to be from the 1800s. Somehow in my sleep-deprived brain, I thought it was my own life-sized doll and ignored it and went back to sleep. It definitely wasn't. It was the wrong color and the doll was facing the TV, so there's no way it was her. I didn't tell my mum this time round because she didn't believe me the last time. After that, stuff started moving around. Things fall off the stairs that are carpet. The lights around the house turn on and off at random. I hear people walking around the house all the time, and still my mother does not believe me, which is really stupid because she believes in ghosts. I affectionately named the ghost girl Lizzie because it just felt right. Finally, one day I'm out with my friends doing teenage stuff. It's roughly 11 p.m. at night, and all of a sudden, my mum calls me. Tell Lizzie not to scare the crap out of me. Turns out, she'd gotten up to use the bathroom, and when she returned to go back to bed, she'd seen a dark orb hovering over her side of the bed. When she saw it, it quickly exited via the ceiling, and then she called me. Not long after that, we found the local news articles about our neighborhood and the cemetery. We also found out that during a flood one year, one particular casket kept popping back up and it had to be moved, and that a lot of the neighborhood still have headstones visible in their yard. We're horrified because we definitely noticed some weirdly flat stones out near our garden, and one only 5 or 6 feet from fruit trees that we planted. So now we all accept that we live with a ghost or 2. Weird stuff happens all the time. They stop throwing stuff off the stairs, but they now show up in our Xbox Connect, turn sinks on, and occasionally knock stuff over. But I also sometimes will hear them talking faintly. I haven't seen either of them since the first time, but I know they're still about. We treat them like family, talk to them, offer them snacks, leave toys out to play with. Life is weird, and new people in the house never take long to notice. Lately, I've also been seeing a shadow cat hanging around. We have 2 cats already, but neither of them can disappear through walls, so there's that. Another story I have to share is one day my friends and I were leaving the house. I don't remember where we were going, and my mum comes around the corner swearing she saw someone walking down the hallway. We were all in the living room and my brothers weren't home. At the time, we had our Xbox set up on a dresser with its own TV so the kids could play games without taking over the living room, and said dresser was right next to the doorway that leads into the hall. My mom says she thinks she heard the Xbox turn on, and comments on how easy it would be probably for the ghost to turn it on since the button is so sensitive. We all have a chuckle at the ghosts playing video games and continue to the door. Not 10 minutes later, my mum calls me to tell me that the Xbox had in fact been turning on and off repeatedly, that she was trying to watch TV and it started to freak her out. I laugh because of course Lizzie would do that. You just told her how it works, I say, and I hear my mum politely ask her to stop because it's distracting, and the beeping from the console stops for maybe a minute or two before it starts again. My mum makes me come back early, supposedly because Lizzie likes me, and she'll stop if I ask her. The Xbox continued to turn on and off at random, albeit every once in a while now for the next few weeks. Now when our consoles or even the TV turn on by itself, we'll ask her what she wants to watch and play, but never get an answer. 2 years ago, 2 friends and I decided to go on a late night adventure and drive to a bigger city about an hour away from our hometown. We got to the city around 11 PM and were just exploring random areas there. I had my iPhone plugged into the car playing music, and out of nowhere the music cut out and the screen changed to maps. A destination was entered in the map, and a male AI voice began telling us where to go. We decided to follow it like it wasn't something straight out of a horror movie. The first destination it took us was a worn-out road at the back end of a construction site. The road went up to a forest that was surrounded by large fences. There were no trespassing signs everywhere, so we decided to turn around. The GPS then rerouted us to another point about 20 minutes away from the first. We drove to the second point, and it was a dead-end road on the opposite side of the forest from the first road. We were pretty freaked out by the experience, and reconnected my phone and went back home. Fast forward a few days ago. One of my friends who I had gone with was talking to me on the phone. He brought up the experience and we decided to look into it. We found the 2 roads on Google Earth and could see a house in the forest with a clearing behind it. We started doing some research on the house and came across a court document connected to the address. Developers had bought the land and were denied approval to build on the land where the house stood. I didn't think much of it until I read further and saw why they were denied. The clearing we saw on Google Earth ended up being a cemetery where the original settlers of the city were buried. With more research, we came to find that a man who had owned the land sometime before the 90s had moved every headstone, leaving the graves unmarked. It took historians years to discover the cemetery, and they were granted permission to make a thorough report on it. They found 99 grave shafts, but 60 of them were much smaller, meaning they belonged to children. The developers had unveiled in court that they simply moved the remains into a corner of the new subdivision without any cemetery. The other road that we were brought to was on the other side of the forest, as if it wanted us to drive from one side to the other when we didn't make the main road. The weirdest part about this whole experience was when we noticed the court date was exactly 10 years ago from the date we did the research. We found it odd that it took us so long to look into what the GPS could have been taking us to, and that out of every day it happened on the 10-year anniversary. It's pretty crazy. I honestly believed that our GPS was being manipulated by a spirit that belonged to the graveyard, and they wanted to let us know what had happened there. If you care to do your research, it's called Lime Kiln Road, Ancaster. The road into the forest, Bailey Road, Ancaster. Second dead-end road, Cooley Hat Pioneer Cemetery. My entire life, my grandfather has lived in a large home in a somewhat wooded area in a town outside of Dallas, Texas. We would camp out and explore the area when I was younger. before people decided to start building more in that area. In order to get to the house, you would have to turn off the main road into a cemetery. Not sure why, but the road cuts straight through a pretty large old cemetery. I like to go there on nice days and look around sometimes. It's a good walk from my grandfather's house down a road heavily lined with trees. I've seen gravestones with dates as far back as the early 1800s, and they are always really neat in my opinion. So at this point in time, I'm between homes and staying with my grandfather. It was about 1 a.m. and I'm hanging out with a friend from work, telling them about how I like this cemetery. They're interested in going to see the place and want to take some long exposure pictures with a camera that they recently got. So we head that way and I take them to where all the really old graves are. Now, I've always been somewhat sensitive to things considering paranormal. I've had a few weird experiences and tend to trust my instincts when I feel something's off. From the time I parked inside the cemetery that night, I probably knew that I shouldn't be there. My instinct was kicking in. But I ignored my gut, because my friend was excited and I really wanted to show them this cemetery and explore the surrounding woods with them. So we walked along the wood line towards the far back corner where the oldest graves are to take some pictures of the headstones and pay our respects to the people who have been there the longest. My friend takes a lot of pictures and I walk around with the flashlight, adding lighting and reading the graves. The entire time I'm feeling like I'm being watched. I shake the feeling and again ignore my instinct because my friend looks like they're wrapping up. They start looking through their images while I make sure we got all our trash and water bottles that we brought with us. The friend calls me over while I'm doing this and asks me to look at one of the photos they just took of some graves and the tree line. I look at the photo, a little bit freaked out, but I realize I probably need to stay calm for my friend's sake. I look up to where the photo was taken and see what the camera saw. What my friend doesn't see is in the tree line is a large black humanoid mass with glowing red eyes. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but it looked and felt like rage personified. In all my life, all the times I've explored the area, I had never seen or felt anything like that. I asked my friend to slowly start walking back to the car. I'm pretty sure they knew something was wrong because I was dead serious and hardcore staring where they just took that creepy photo. I'm backing my way to the car and watch the shadow watch us as we leave. We get to a point where I can see the car, but not the shadow anymore, so I turn around and start power walking towards my car, key in hand. I'm still on the edge, but I'm feeling better that we're getting out of there. All of a sudden, the shadow appears about 20 foot to my right in the tree line. I tell my friend to run the rest of the way to the car, and at this point we are running, and are almost to the car when my friend glances behind us and sees this thing for the first time. They freak out, speed to the car and frantically leap into the passenger side. I have just gotten my keys in the ignition when the shadow slams into my friend's door, its face right up against the glass. Imagine having a solid shadow, featureless, and then with 2 red LEDs where the eyes are. That's about what we saw menacing us on the other side of the glass. I get in the car and started to pull out as fast as I could without hitting any graves and start to drive the hell out of there. I find the official gate, even though there are plenty of other closer exits to the road, but I've always heard if you enter and leave through the same gate of a cemetery, you leave everything you found there and can't take it with you. I'm telling you now, that's all BS, but that's for another story. We're leaving when this thing is keeping up with us all the way to the gate, and it stops. We head to the main road and to my friend's place, laughing hysterically because the adrenaline was wearing off, and we survived something crazy. I get them home, but I have to go back through the cemetery to get home myself, and thankfully I didn't see the shadow again, but I believe this is because my friend wasn't with me. After that night I had a bunch of more crazy things happen to me in the area while hanging out with them. But I think for now that's enough. I thought we were being respectful. In any case, remember to respect cemeteries, everyone. I have always been interested in the paranormal and going ghost hunting, as me and my friends call it anyway. This story takes place on an October night in 2005, almost 15 years ago now. We had gathered at my dad's house for a party. He lived way out in the country in an old farmhouse. We decided to drive up the road to an old cemetery, because one of my friends showed up with a Ouija board. I said we weren't going to use it at my house, but I was game to use it elsewhere. About 6 of us piled into the vehicles and took off. When we got there, we set the Ouija board up on an old concrete barrier that surrounded the entrance of the cemetery. For context, the cemetery was set on a hill surrounded by cow pastures, fields and trees, and across the road stood a white church. There were 2 security lights that lit up the church area and the entrance to the cemetery. There was 1 more security light that lit the field, next to the only house for about 2 miles. We all stood in a circle, planchette in the center and hands on it. My friend led the seance and asked if there was anything in the cemetery with us. At first, nothing happened and we all stood still and quiet. Then, the planchette slowly moved towards yes. Immediately, we start accusing each other of moving it, of course. But everyone swore they didn't. An eerie feeling fell over us as the planchette moved back to the center of the board. About that time we heard what sounded like wind at first, but then began to get closer and it sounded like footsteps of multiple people running in circles around us. We were all wide-eyed, looking at each other when someone said out loud, "I'm out." Another person said, "We have to tell it bye, or the spirit will follow us." The leader of the group spoke to the board and said something along the lines of, "We are saying goodbye to you," and the planchette quickly jerked to no. It was pretty obvious by how shocked we all were that none of us had done it. Mind you, the sound of the footsteps is still surrounding us. The planchette moves to the center and we say bye again, and again it moves to no and back to the center. This time we all say together, "Goodbye, we're leaving," and it slowly, agonizingly moved to goodbye. We were relieved and took off running to the cars, which were parked by the entrance of the cemetery side of the road. Me and my buddy jump into the truck. Then I hear my friend scream, "Guys, I can't find my keys." She checks the ignition, her pockets, and all our friends check their cars and their pockets, to no avail. Everyone else here loads back into the truck, and we speed the 3 miles down the road to my dad's house. My friend searches her pockets, her purse, and everywhere, but couldn't find them anywhere. Eventually, someone takes her home and she says she'll get her spare and get a ride back to her car in the morning. We were all too scared to go back and look for them that night. The next day, my friend searches the cemetery and never finds the keys, even in broad daylight. We haven't walked around the whole lot, and where we used the cemetery was very close to where we parked, which didn't leave much room for things to get lost. Me and several friends scoured the entire cemetery over the course of the next week, but never found the keys. My friend said she was 100% positive they were left in the ignition when she got out the car. It's where I left mine, and a common practice in the area, where I'm from, which, like I said, is pretty rural. This was by far the scariest, but not the only Ouija experience I've had. I have had countless paranormal experiences during my life. I have had a number of paranormal experiences happen to me during the course of my life. My first experience was at my own home in Florida about 6 years ago. We had just moved about roughly a year before, and the house was brand spanking new. We were the only residents ever to live here. My dad and his wife both went on a trip to another state, and my brother was back with his dad 2,000 miles away. I was completely alone in my 2-story house for 2 weeks. I've been home alone countless times, and the first week was nothing out the ordinary. But by the second, I was feeling uneasy with my surroundings. And you know that feeling that you get when someone stares at you, and you immediately look and there's something locking eyes? That's the feeling I had when I was always throwing my eyes and head around the corner of my house or doors. I personally am not one to freak out nor be scared, so I didn't think much of it. I went to sleep that night like I normally would. During the night, I felt pressure on my bed. That same pressure when someone sits on your bed, it was enough to wake me up and make me look at that general direction. I thought it was my dad sitting on my bed, which is something he is known to do, and it would often wake me up. Perhaps it was him telling me he'd come home early. But when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing. It was pitch black, and for what felt like the longest 2 seconds of my life, I was just staring into a dark room, but could feel the side of the bed being pressed down, and all of a sudden the pressure eased as if someone stood up. I started breathing heavily and jumped from a laying down position to my feet on top of the bed and tried to pull my light switch from my fan on. As soon as the light came on, could I notice that I was alone in the room. I was panting, feeling sick to my stomach looking around. I sprinted to the bathroom and locked myself in, putting water in my face and trying to comprehend what exactly I had just experienced. You can bet the rest of the week I was cautious around the house, since I was still feeling uneasy and skeptical. My uneasiness disappeared roughly 2 months after all this, and I never had such a strange experience again within my own home. My second experience was 4 years after the first. Me, my father, and his wife decided to take a road trip. This time, we landed in Charleston, South Carolina, and my dad thought it would be cool to visit the Drayton Hall plantation built in the 1700s, as it was so nearby. We're history nerds and love to visit old historical buildings, museums, and cities, and we take our tours, so this wasn't a big leap for us. It was the middle of summer and easily 98 degrees and humid outside for the entire tour. It felt like we were in an oven, and the sunlight was just incinerating. As soon as the tour ended, we decided to leave, but one of the tour guides told us that down the dirt road of the property, if we look to our left as we drive, there is a modern plastic arch that if we walked through further into the property using the arch as reference and kept going straight, we would find ourselves in the old slave cemetery. She gave us a pamphlet about it and we left. Mind you, my family are non-believers, and my father especially always talks about how the paranormal doesn't exist. We thought it would be cool to see an old 18th century slave cemetery, so we drove and parked our car on the edge of the dirt road, but my stepmother decided to stay in the vehicle, as it was so hot, and she had air conditioning. Me and my dad walked all the way to the location and got lost since it was taking me further into the forested area. And we expected tombstones and such on a clearing. But as we walked in, we read the pamphlet, and it said the cemetery was actually a mass grave where hundreds of slaves are buried, and that we should look out for the only market, which is this pair of tombstones that were put in recently of deceased people who wanted to be buried there, as they traced their lineage to be that plantation. We eventually found the tombstones that we were now in, because the area looked untouched and it just had this pair of modern tombstones that looked new in the middle of the forest. surrounded by this tree, which each one being about 12 feet apart from each other and sunlight peeking through the leaves. We walked around for 15 minutes talking and speculating where the slaves were buried and how big the area of the graves could actually be. Remember, it was hot balls outside, and there was absolutely zero wind whatsoever. At one point we found ourselves at the tombstones and decided to leave. My father started walking away as I read the tombstones for a solid minute or two, and I had this cold area in the back of my neck and the entire back of my right arm, and I could feel cold on my shoulder through my shirt. I froze in place for a few seconds, and it was extremely distinct, and there was absolutely no wind or gust, nothing. It was just as cold as ice. As soon as I looked at my dad and talked to him, he walked away. The cold disappeared, almost instantly. A few months later after this, I found out coincidentally in college about cold spots during paranormal investigations and completely blew my mind about it and made me rethink what was happening in the plantation. Ever since the second event, it's made me look more into the paranormal, and I'm not sure if I'm a believer or not, but it certainly freaked me out. I moved to a new apartment at the start of last month. It's only got one room besides the bathroom and the kitchen, and was fully furnished. The view from the balcony is stunning. However, there's also the graveyard of this small village I moved to that's literally around the corner, and I can see this charming graveyard from my kitchen window if I stand on my toes. I went there once because it happened to be the way I was walking as I was chatting with my boyfriend. It's a very beautiful place, well taken care of, with some noble graves and a very small church in the middle. It has no locks on the gate, so people can visit whenever they feel like it. The thing that kind of bothered me was the fact that the gates make this really annoying noise, like they need to be oiled. After we got back from our walk, we never returned, but we kept speaking about it. At the time, we really didn't notice it, but my boyfriend was very nervous and seemed kind of scared. But I was also just enjoying the walk and looking around, looking at the graves, that I hardly paid attention to his mild discomfort. It was only a few days ago that he got really upset when he saw the grave of a girl who passed away this year in March, at the young age of 5. Looking at him, you wouldn't really expect him to be upset by a mere grave. I spoke to him about it until we changed the subject as he got sad, and he eventually went home. Fast forward to yesterday. I woke up pretty late since I was staying up late doing the laundry, sorting out clothes, and looking at things I needed to get rid of. I know for a fact that I cleaned the apartment to its peak so that there was no possibility of garbage and no dirty dishes or anything. When I came back home yesterday, I discover a puddle. I thought my mind must have been playing tricks on me, or maybe the floor was reflecting light from a lantern outside my window, but I touched it and smelt it and it was clearly water. When I looked up to the ceiling, it looked fine and was dry, no leaks. So I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had just forgotten to clean something in my haste the other day. That was weird, I thought. I did leave the house in a hurry after all. I was very tired, but just couldn't seem to fall asleep. I was restless and felt as if it would be wrong to go to sleep now. So I got dressed again and took a walk and stopped by the graveyard and sat on the bench in front of the gates. I remember being exhausted and my legs felt like they were pulsating. After a while I went back home and the puddle had vanished. Everything was as it was before. As per habit, I lock my door twice at night. Last night, as I wanted to lay down to fall asleep, I heard something playing around with the door. It was 2 a.m. I was petrified and frozen under the blanket. I knew for a fact there couldn't be anyone there since my landlord lives in the apartment below and has been asleep at the time, and the door to enter the house itself is always locked at night. I've heard how something or someone was trying to turn my doorknob and got more aggressive every minute. Even though it's the middle of August, I felt as if I were in a freezer because it became so cold. I could hear my door shaking, and the doorknob was probably about to fall off at that point, and then it stopped. Slowly, but it somehow did. Not much later, I heard crying, and I listened very closely when I heard someone whisper, "Mummy, please let me in. I'm scared of the dark." At this point, I almost wept myself. I grabbed my phone, which I took with me, and called my boyfriend. The crying stopped the moment I dialed his number, and when he answered, I slowly crawled back into the living room before I finally started talking to him. "Someone, please, tell me how I'm supposed to sleep at night." This event occurred back in the beginning of October 2019. But let me give you a little backstory. A branch of my mother's side of the family moved from Illinois. They were actually all immigrants from England to the Pacific Northwest country. I currently live here, and back in the 1880s, to work in the mining and logging industries, at least 3 subsequent generations of the family moved here at the same time. A number of these family members were buried in a family plot in a historic, large and still active cemetery on a hill overlooking the town that I live in. There are a total of 5 people buried in our family plot. My great-great-grandfather, Elijah Bird, buried in 1911. My great-great-grandmother, Emily Bird, buried 1927. My great-grandfather, Nigel Bird, buried 1940, son of the 2 mentioned above. My great-grandmother, Deborah B. Bird, buried 1991. And my great-great-aunt Sadie, buried 1902, aged 12. Now, to my story from October 2019. I was riding in the passenger seat of my husband's truck. We were driving to my brother-in-law's house. We were passing by this cemetery, and I have a great interest in my family history, so I've done a good deal of research about them, and that is how I know where many of them are buried. The family plot is located about 25 feet in front of the cemetery fence, and about 30 feet from the road that passes by the front of the cemetery, the road we were driving on. The plot is marked with a large headstone and has the surname carved in large letters facing the road. It is very easy to spot. There are some bushes along a portion of the fence line of the cemetery, but they are not present where my family plot is located. On this clear October afternoon, as we were passing my family's plot, I looked out my window, as I always do if we're going by, and was surprised to see someone sitting on my family plot facing the large gravestone. I turned my head and body to see her as we progressed down the road, and when I finally got a good look at her, I saw her for around 10 to 15 seconds. I saw that she was small and female, in a white dress with some ruffles on the shoulders. To me it looked very old-fashioned, like something worn during the 1800s, late. She was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest and her forearms resting on her knees. I only saw her left arm. It was wrapped around her bent left leg. Her brown hair was long and, as far as I could tell, was lying loosely down her back. I caught glimpses of what I thought were black boots on her feet. She didn't move at all while I was looking at her. I asked my husband if he saw a girl in the graveyard and he said no, but he had been concentrating on the road. I told him I saw a girl sitting on my family's plot, and he just grunted and said it was weird. I thought a lot about it on the way to my brother-in-law's house, and while we were visiting we took the same route home, but by this time it was dark so I couldn't see anything in the cemetery as it wasn't lit. My mind went straight to Sadie, who died as a preteen and is buried there. She could have been around the same size as the girl I saw during her life, and could have worn something like that girl was wearing. I never have seen an image though of what Sadie actually looked like. My mother had a lot of old family photos from her side of the family, including 2 or 3 photos of passed away infants from the 1880s to 90s from my great-grandma. So, lots of pictures, but none of Sadie that we know of. Safe to say I was quite creeped out by what I saw. It could very well have been a living person dressed up in Victoria-era clothing. That does seem far more likely. But it's odd and kind of creepy nonetheless, just to be sitting on someone's grave, don't you think? I find it more disturbing that there was a living person using my family's grave as part of some dress-up game, than for it to be a ghost. I'm the only one in my family that is descended from these people that lives in the entire county. Thinking about Sadie does make me a little sad. She passed so young. Child and infant mortality were very common back then, and it is tragic. I have no information of what she died of. I just thought I'd share this, because I've been thinking about this sighting lately, and wanted to see what others think of it. The story I'm going to tell you happened when I was little, and is basically my mother and uncle's version. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food I ate, so my body had no defenses, and I was sick pretty often. I never spent weeks on intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, no one knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to find out what was happening to me. They would make a lot of tests, even for rarer conditions, but they were always negative. My mother was completely desperate, and in her own words, I was going to pass before I could even figure out what it was trying to take me. So one day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He and my dad's brother and he live with his wife and the mum of his wife, who is also like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place that has a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the older generation. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to take flowers to her father's grave on All Saints' Day. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery when you're pregnant or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess them in order to live again. My mother and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. My mum and uncle said I was screaming and crying the whole time in the car and that I didn't want to go. I didn't even know where we were going, or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving and suddenly we ran into a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car and then he realized the brakes weren't working. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this, and then in a matter of seconds, the car stopped completely, inches from colliding. When we were already standing, the strangest thing of the trip had happened. They both felt as if several people from outside their cars were pushing the car and shaking it from one side to another. I was about to scream. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to go in, but I finally did. I was crying the whole time, and when I got out, I was in a much better mood. My mum bought me donuts in our way to the car, and I ate one and then puked. But it was as if I puked something with sand and texture, something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got out just in case I was going to keep going. Suddenly I did a strange sound like a burp, but it was way too loud and deep sounding for a 4-year-old kid. The next day on Monday, one of the doctors called me. One of the tests was positive. They already knew what was wrong with me. Ever since I was younger, I have always been drawn to places where the dead dwell, such as local cemeteries, columbarium and mausoleums. I've always had a strange sensation when stepping foot inside cemetery grounds, particularly within indoor mausoleums. It feels like a chill coupled with an increased spiritual pressure, as if gravity is intensifying. This feeling is always spot on as soon as I would enter a cemetery or mausoleum. I would have thought that I would want to avoid places like that, especially when I'm not visiting my deceased loved ones. However, I find myself subconsciously drawn to these places, Just driving by local cemeteries/memorial parks, I'm subconsciously drawn to enter, even if I express no intention whatsoever. I thought it would perhaps be my emotional response to entering a place of the dead. Therefore, I asked my friend to conduct an experiment where I would deprive myself of my senses, i.e. wear a blindfold as well as earmuffs. He would then drive me around to local places, grocery stores, libraries, and the cemetery, and then tap me when he stopped. I would then identify if I were in a cemetery or not. Shockingly, I was able to identify whether the places were cemeteries or not based off of this feeling, or increased gravity as I call it. As a scientific individual, I am highly skeptical of the supernatural. However, I have not been able to discern why I have this particular sensation, neurological, spiritual, emotional, or otherwise. What is most baffling to me was the ability to sense spot on and more than once and accurately whether I was in a cemetery, even by blocking my sound and sight. Recently, I was in Charleston for a dance-related event. My parents and I like to go on ghost tours when visiting places like Charleston, mainly just to hear the history of buildings and stuff. We decided to do a ghost tour of the Magnolia Cemetery. There were a lot of cool stories that I enjoyed hearing, but the one that stood out to me the most was Little Annie Aiken. I don't remember much of her story, but I do remember our tour guide telling us that Little Annie was a very active child and loved to play. We were told that she passed away at 3 of a sickness, which I can't remember. During the tour, I started hearing a young girl singing, but it was very faint, and I couldn't make out what the song was. I asked my mum and dad if they heard it, and they both said no. Also, at several points, I felt something wrap around my free hand. Sometimes it felt like a small hand, but other times my hand just went cold, and sometimes felt like I was being pulled into the opposite direction that we were going. Once we arrived at Little Annie's tomb, our tour guide told us her story. She then told us that sometimes, if Little Annie really likes you, she'll grab a hold of your hand. She also said that people have reported hearing a little girl singing Ring Around the Rosie, and a small child wrapping their cold hands around someone else. Once our tour guide had told us that, my dad asked if that's what I was hearing, and I told him I felt the hand too. I was hesitant to tell our tour guide then because we had a very freaked out and dramatic woman on the tour, and I didn't want to freak her out anymore. So I told the tour guide after it was all over. It was a very cool experience, and I've never had anything like that happen to me before. I guess Little Annie must have liked me. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's cemetery stories. Sorry for not uploading the weekend. I didn't really intend to take both days off. But truth is, I have a medical thing, and I'm quite nervous for it. It's nothing serious, don't you guys worry, please. But yeah, just some strange stuff going on, and I was quite nervous about it all. Today, in fact, I was going to go get my bloods and stuff, you know, all the tests you need done, standard procedures. And I think the doctor forgot to tell me to do the fast, which is something most people know already, to not eat before you get your bloods done for 12 hours. But I either forgot or didn't know, so there you go. I went and I couldn't get it done. One of the things that you might not know about me is that I am very, very scared of needles, so I'm going to have to be particularly brave tomorrow when I get jabbed up and, have my blood extracted. So yeah, that's going to be fun. But hopefully all goes well, and this small thing can go away soon. Alright guys, I want to give you a huge thanks to all my members and all my patrons. Really, thank you so much for your continued support. It really does mean a lot. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.